Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. Today I'm going to do a quick run over the top of a number of the big disruptors I see either currently underway or emerging in the watch industry, and what's going to change our industry and the hobby that we're in over the next decade or so. Now, some of these have already started and are completely obvious. Some of them are less so. I'm not going to attack any of them in great detail today. This is really just a quick run over all of the issues I see bubbling away, which are going to change our environment. In coming up with this list, I was inspired by a previous disruption, the last major disruption that we've gone through, which I'd probably say was the Quartz Crisis or Quartz Revolution, depending on where you live. Now, one of the great problems with the Quartz Revolution or Quartz Crisis is the word quartz, because that would tend to imply that the thing that happened, or if not the thing that happened, then at least the determining factor in what came about was the advent of this new technology, quartz. And whilst that certainly was a significant thing and may well have been the spark that ignited the flame that burnt down a lot of the Swiss watch industry of the time, of those sort of the 1970s, I think there was clearly more fuel in that fire. Some of the other things that in fact, what I'd say before you move on is, to understand what happened there, I'd recommend this book, which I think I'll see if it works. The History of the Swiss watch industry, from Jacques David to Nicolas Hayek, by Pierre-Yves Dons. Hope I didn't murder that name. It's a really dry, really quite boring read, but it's quite forensic in looking at really the whole development of the Swiss watch industry and what happened during that crisis period. And it really emphasized that the advent of quartz was a big thing, but the Swiss did see it coming. They were prepared for it. They were building their own quartz movements, and yet everything still caught fire and burnt down. Why is that? And the book, and what I would say is, you cannot ignore the fact that the currencies changed massively, and that in exactly the same time as you had this huge change in technology, you also had the entire world giving up on the old Bretton Woods gold standard, going to much more dynamic market set currencies. And during the time 1970 to 1979, the value of the US dollar against the Swiss franc absolutely plummeted. That alone would have doubled or tripled or even quadrupled the price of some Swiss watches. During the 1970s, we're also talking an era of massive global trade growth. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the Swiss watch industry or the car manufacturing industry or the television industry. The 1960s was the time when Sony and Toshiba and Sanyo and Panasonic and yes, Seiko and Citizen burst forth into the world and were changing everything. So it wasn't just this unique thing happening in watches. This global expansion of exports out of Asia, mostly Japan at the time, but Asia more generally, was happening across the economy. And I think we sometimes seem to forget that when we're talking what happened to Swiss watches. As part of all of that, you also had all the rules changing around how trade occurred. Big companies were okay, so a big company like Seiko could throw its weight around, but the new rules that were emerging did not do well for cartels and associations. And so those loose confederations of watch companies that existed in the previous if you like, iteration of Swatch in OSAG and SHH, they were not helped by the rules that were going on in global trade, that was emerging in global trade at the time. The other big thing that happened was that in 1971, the Swiss made rule requiring 60% of watches was instituted. Now, some of you are going to be saying, well, how can that hurt the Swiss industry? The reason it was implemented is because during the 60s, a lot of the Swiss brands were actually integrating themselves into global supply chains, not unlike now. And they were using a lot of manufacturing facilities in Asia during the 60s, and that was helping them deal with some of the emerging currency threats and the emerging trade rules changes. And so to have the Swiss made rule come in at exactly the same time as the rules for exporting and importing were changing, and exactly the same time that the Swiss franc was just escalating in value, was really uncomfortable for a lot of brands. So while we talk about the Quartz crisis, we really could have equally said the currency crisis or the global trade crisis. All of those things all came together during the 1970s and led to this huge disruption to the Swiss watch industry. Something similar is going on today. There isn't any one disruptor. There's a family of disruptors. And it's important to understand all of them, particularly if you're a watch brand, because in there are your risks and opportunities. Like I said, I'm not going to go into any of these in great detail, but to skim over the top, mainly because I'll save that for videos later, but to skim over the top, this is what I see as the big disruptors in the watch market right now. The first is the relationship between brands and consumers. The rise of social media driven marketing and the relative demise of the more traditional advertising led marketing. The new dynamics that are happening between the brands and their consumers. The expectation now that brands will use things like Instagram to perhaps give leads and hints about where they're thinking of going and get feedback and respond to that feedback. The two girls on 10 and 2 Media, great podcast, go check them out, spoke about this, and they talk in glowing terms about how Zodiac have teased that there might be different kinds of watches coming, running polls about what would you like to see, and then appearing to shape the colorways that are made available based on what the audience wants. This is a radical change in how watches are designed and built, and I think a lot of watch companies are really going to struggle to deal with how to deal with this new media, not just about getting their message out, but also about how to get information back in and build that into your system. The next question the next big disruptor that I feel coming into the industry is fashion. For so long, when I started into this hobby, I would say to my wife that men seem to come to fashion through watches. Women seem to come to watches through fashion. So men were always kind of suspicious of watch brands that were also associated with a fashion brand. To call someone a fashion watch is a deadly insult. If a watch brand is associated with a fashion house, they're viewed with significant suspicion. That seems to be changing. What we're seeing is a changing relationship between the ideas of fashion and watches. So at one end, what we're seeing is brands which are clearly fashion brands like Bulgari, Louis Vuitton, Mont Blanc, not necessarily fashion but not watch, clearly and deliberately staking out a place as a real watch brand, buying movement houses, developing their own movements, being serious about being a watch company, but equally not giving up on any of their fashion stuff. They're making watches part of this larger fashion organization. So what you're also seeing is brands that had allowed themselves to become fashion brands doing everything within their power to either rehabilitate their reputation, or they're buying other brands that they can then build to be themselves fashionable. So you look at, first off, I'd say Movado clearly seems to be trying to get the Movado name back into the frame of a serious watchmaker, and pushing out to people like Ariel Adams at a blog to watch to get them to review their watches. You see Invicta buying the Glycine brand and seeming to treat that with some respect. We're not seeing all the horrible things happen to Glycine that Invicta does to its own brand, but we are seeing Glycine get pushed into the media, into our consciousness far more. We're seeing Fossil do the same with Zodiac. Zodiac was a brand that was totally in the doldrums, not really going anywhere. It didn't own any of its own IP or its own addresses. But Fossil, which is your archetypal fashion watch brand, pushing it really hard and bringing back Zodiac, a storied old Swiss watch brand, but bringing it forward with a really interesting sort of 21st century fashion kind of push. So what I see is that continuing to happen. I continue to see brands which we have slagged off as fashion brands, whole new brands which are very fashion oriented but push at the same time a real kind of hardcore watch fandom across the board. I see this happening a lot more, and I think the division between what's a real watch and what's a fashion watch is going to change enormously. I'm not the only person, by the way, who thinks that that's no bad thing. I'll put a link into a video that Terry Baldessar did with Jean-Claude Biver, where he says not the same thing, but a similar sort of thing, where he talks about the influence of fashion brands and how they're not that great ogre, they're not that great negative. They bring people into this community. This next one is absolutely obvious. Everyone's talking about it, and that's going to be the impact of smartwatches or wearable tech on the watch market. That's clearly going to have an impact, if for no other reason than it's a new device that takes up a piece of real estate on the human body, the wrist, that until recently the watch by and large had to itself. Again, like fashion watches, I see this as a disruptor, not as a risk. The Watch Pro, there was a story on Watch Pro recently where they were talking about the advent of the Apple Watch had not had much, if any at all, negative impact on sales of watches. And in fact, there's some evidence that long term it seems to be leading to an increase in people wearing a watch and may actually have positive flow-on effects. I believe that to be true. I think that the smartwatch or the wearable tech is actually going to assist people in getting used to the idea of wearing something again. I also, though, believe it's going to have some really interesting effects on the low end of the market, because it is teaching people that a $400 or $500 wearable item on your wrist is disposable. And so it may play into pushing the market for normal wristwatches away from the bottom end and increase the emphasis on something that costs more than a smartwatch. So the smartwatch becomes an alternative gateway in the same way as the fashion watch is an alternative gateway. The next big change I see coming is around the gendered nature of watches. I've already said that fashion watches and the design aspects of watches are going to become increasingly important. Almost by definition, that's going to mean that movement technology will become a little less important. I've already said that increasingly we're going to see smart devices become one of the gateway entry points into the watch hobby. And so that's going to bring people in who are used to the idea of wearing something on their wrist. They're going to be very used to the idea of the fashion side of it, but they may be less interested in the mechanics and the engineering side. All of that kind of aligns with the sorts of things that we're also hearing about what women find interesting in watches. Women enjoy watches. Women enjoy jewelry. They don't necessarily in the numbers that men do, enjoy the kinds of, the mechanical side of it. So if you combine the idea that watches and the watch hobby is going to get a bit more fashionable, is going to become a little bit more aligned with people coming out of the wearable tech world, and there's this huge community that's largely untapped of women who could be interested in watches, I foresee significant changes in the market moving forward, where watches will become a little bit smaller, become a little bit more design focused. There might be some rolling back on chasing the highest possible specs, the deepest possible depths, the highest possible accuracies, and instead looking at creating good, solid, but really attractive and almost genderless watches. And I can see that again being a big disruptor to the market. The companies that can nail that and can establish themselves in that sort of Goldilocks place of the real watch company that sells real watches to real women and takes them seriously, but at the same time doesn't force them to go places they don't want to be, could be the next best thing. And finally, there's big going on in who actually buys watches, or at least where in the world watches are bought. Now, we've all spoken a lot about China, and it's absolutely true. China now constitutes, as I said in my last video, China now constitutes more than 60, I think it's more than 50% of Swatch's sales, and large proportions of Richemont and LVMH, and I'm going to guess Rolex as well. But get out of China and look more broadly. If you go to the FH figures for Swiss watch exports in 2018, obviously the 2019 figures aren't out yet, but look at the 2018 figures, and in particular look at the figures for growth between by country between 2016 and 2018, and you'll see that like South Korea has grown during that time. South Korea has grown by an average of 32%, Russia by an average of 26%, India by 44%, the Middle East, Qatar 58%, Bahrain 42%, Oman 40%. These are all countries that are in like the top 20 or so of export countries. So for South Korea, that change represents 210 million Swiss francs a year in additional expenditure, and that's got to have an effect on the kinds of watches that sell, and therefore the brands that do well or the brands that do poorly. So those are the big disruptors I see in the watch market over the next 5 to 10 years. Actually, some of them are already here. Some of them we're just beginning to see. Some of them I can sense, but I don't think they're actually having much effect now, although I believe that they'll grow. One of the things is that some companies will do extremely well out of this. Some companies will do extremely poorly. Looking back at the Quartz Crisis, for example, the Quartz Crisis pretty much almost destroyed Omega. They went into that period as, I think, probably the biggest watch company in the world. They came out of it struggling to survive. During that time, they did almost everything wrong. They chased the market. They were working really hard on new watches and trying to get something back, investing huge amounts of capital in places where nothing came back to them, and missing the opportunities that other watch brands that had less capital and less ability but were a bit smarter were able to take advantage of. And probably the biggest example of a company which did really well in the Quartz Crisis was Rolex. They entered that period as just another watch brand. Not particularly. They were well known. They were famous, but they weren't anything like the Rolex of now. But they came out of that period as the quintessential kind of middle class watch, aspirant watch, and that was because they didn't chase the technology. They didn't chase trying to come up with a new and innovative watch. The watches they came into the 70s with were not that dissimilar to the watches that they came out of the 70s with. But what they did do is they saw an opportunity to consolidate the business. So it was really during that time that Rolex SA started buying their suppliers at vastly discounted asset values because of what was happening in the market, and that gave them all the control and all of the ability to do what they do now with their structures. So Rolex might not have been a great watchmaker during the 70s, but they were a fantastic businessman. And the conflicting fortunes of Omega and Rolex during the Quartz Crisis probably do more than anything else to point out both the risks and opportunities to every brand right now. Right now we've got wearables, increased roles of fashion, increased involvement of women, and I should probably also say more interest in men in the jewelry side rather than the tool side of watches. We've got wearable tech coming on board, and we've got all new buyers from all new parts of the world. The companies that can get on top of those and that can see, what do I need to emphasize, what do I need to play back on, how do I manage all of this, they are the ones who will emerge from this period as new and powerful and dominant. And the companies that can't work it out will die because they will make the wrong choices. They will invest way too much capital in decisions that don't pay off. They will go broke and they'll vanish. We will find out in the next 5 to 10 years which companies are which. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to sort of poke a bit more at some of these topics, and then maybe think about which watch brands are well positioned to take advantage of these and which watch brands might struggle. So that's it. That's my take. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. While I remember a wristwatch check, today I am wearing my Seiko Baby Marine Master SBDC063, I think it is. I can't believe I remembered a reference number. If you hang on a little while, a card will come up with my contact details both on Instagram and by email. If you want to see more about my life and particularly my watch collecting, go check me out on Instagram, follow me there. If you want to get in contact with me, DM me through Instagram or send me an email. What I would love is to know your thoughts. Have I missed some of the big things that could be disrupting or are disrupting the watch industry? Are there other things emerging which could shake things up that I've missed? I'd love to hear your comments. Thanks very much. Bye.